It had been only 6 months since Madison Rollins moved into her new home at the edge of a quiet, tree-lined suburb in northern Georgia. The house wasn't grand by any means. It was modest, with sun-faded shutters and an older kidney-shaped pool in the backyard. But it was hers. She'd bought it after a long, grueling divorce that left her more emotionally drained than financially ruined. And the decision to leave the chaos of Atlanta behind felt like the only logical move. Here, the birds chirped more than sirens screamed, and for the first time in years, she could sleep without leaving a lamp on in the hallway. She didn't know many neighbors yet, but she was content to let that be. The quiet was a salve, and solitude a deliberate choice. She kept her days simple. Freelance accounting work from her home office, tending to the garden, slowly coming back to life under her care, and, on rare moments of calm, floating in her pool at dusk, staring up at a sky that no longer had to share space, with aircraft noise or the flashing lights of ambulances. It was during one of those serene evenings in late March, as the sun dipped behind the tree line and the cicadas began their nightly hum, that she noticed the towel. It wasn't hers. Draped casually over one of the pool chairs, it had the garish pattern of something bought at a discount store. Lime green, streaked with fading flowers. A pair of cheap plastic flip-flops were tucked underneath the lounger, and an empty can of Diet Coke perched on the edge of the concrete ledge by the deep end. Madison stood still for several seconds, processing the scene with a slow, dawning discomfort. She hadn't invited anyone over. She hadn't met anyone she'd want to invite. Her property line was clearly marked. The side gate was latched every night, and no maintenance worker had been scheduled. Frowning, she picked up the can with a paper towel and dropped it into the trash, her eyes scanning the fence for any signs of tampering. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints on the soft edge of the grass, no broken latch or scuffed planks. Maybe it had been kids? Some strange neighborhood prank? A mistake? But then it happened again. Only this time, she caught her. It was a Tuesday morning when Madison decided to water the hibiscus along the back edge of the pool, still in her robe, coffee cooling on the brick ledge beside her. As she rounded the corner, she saw the water ripple unnaturally, and then a large, floral-capped head emerged. Madison froze. A heavy-set woman, perhaps in her late 50s or early 60s, was doing a slow breaststroke in the deep end, completely at ease, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Her arms parted the water with methodical grace, her face tilted toward the sky, unaware, or uncaring, of Madison's presence. "Excuse me," Madison called out, her voice sharp, startled but polite. The woman turned, lazily blinking water from her eyes. She squinted for a second, then smiled. "Oh, you're the new girl," she said, paddling toward the edge. "Didn't think you'd be up this early. I usually come by before lunch." Madison was too stunned to respond for a moment. She watched as the woman hoisted herself out of the water with surprising ease, her one-piece suit clinging to her body. She grabbed a towel, her towel, one Madison had left folded by the grill the night before, and began dabbing her face. "Who are you?" Madison asked finally, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman, now calmly toweling off her arms, gave a friendly chuckle. Karen Temple. I live 3 houses down, the blue place with the porch swing. This pool's been sort of open, you know? Ever since the Johnsons moved out, we've all kind of used it when it's hot. They didn't mind. You're new, so I figured we'd keep the same arrangement." Madison felt a strange heat build in her chest, not just embarrassment, but an almost surreal disbelief. She stepped closer, arms crossed, trying to choose her words carefully. "This is my property," she said evenly. "I didn't authorize anyone to be here. I keep the gate locked." Karen raised a brow, drying her feet now. "Oh, that old gate? You've got to slam it hard. It never really latches. Don't worry, I've been coming here for years." "But I live here now," Madison said more firmly, "and I didn't give permission." Karen blinked, then gave a slow shrug, as if the conversation bored her. Well, I guess we'll just have to talk it through. No need to get all stiff about it. It's just water, honey. And if you're going to live around here, you might want to lighten up a little. We're a tight community. Madison watched her leave the backyard without another word, her flip-flops slapping against the pavement, the gate creaking shut behind her with a soft clink. She stood there for several minutes after, heart hammering strangely. There was no anger yet, just a stunned numbness, like something had just walked through her boundary and rearranged the furniture of her life without asking. That night, she barely slept. She checked the gate lock twice. She even installed a wireless motion sensor by the side path, telling herself it was for raccoons. But by morning, her discomfort had curdled into quiet resolve. She wasn't someone who caused trouble, but neither was she someone who tolerated being bulldozed. Madison had learned boundaries the hard way during her marriage. She'd learned how easily people could smile while stepping over you. This time, she wouldn't wait until she was elbow-deep in regret before pushing back. The next day, she drove to the local hardware store. She bought a chain and padlock rated for industrial use, 2 new signs, one that read, "Private property, no trespassing," and another, which she had custom printed after a brief online search, "Pool closed due to health violation." Below it, a smaller placard, "Do not enter. Violators will be prosecuted." She didn't mention names, but she did print a picture she'd found on the community Facebook page, Karen smiling at a summer potluck, holding a pie dish in both hands. She laminated it, taped it next to the sign. She wasn't trying to humiliate anyone, but she also wasn't interested in being ignored. If polite words didn't work, maybe visible consequences would. When the sign went up, she felt a strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction. She wasn't someone who liked drama, but she also wasn't someone's doormat. The next morning, when she looked out from her kitchen window, Karen's face was no longer smiling in a pie-laden photo. It was glowering from across the street, arms folded, eyes narrowed, watching the sign flutter in the wind like a personal insult. Madison sipped her coffee, not breaking eye contact. Let it flutter. Let it burn a little. This wasn't a shared pool. It wasn't a community amenity. It was her home, her sanctuary, and if the price of peace was standing up a little taller than she wanted to, so be it. She didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. The knock on the gate wasn't casual. It was hard, deliberate, like someone demanding entry into a space they never had a right to. Madison stepped out without hesitation, keeping the pool between her and the fence. Karen stood on the other side, her fingers gripping the top bar, her frame pressing into the metal as if sheer size could make the barrier irrelevant. Her expression was twisted into a parody of a smile, though every line in her face screamed contempt. "You gonna come talk to me like a grown-up? Or you just hiding behind fences now?" Karen called out, her voice pitched high enough to carry. Madison didn't move closer. "What do you want?" Karen blinked slowly, performing irritation. "We need to talk about that little stunt you pulled. Putting up signs with my face on them? Chaining the gate like we're in some kind of prison yard? What's your problem?" Madison remained steady. "You used my pool without permission. That's trespassing. I'm not going to let it happen again." Karen gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Sweetheart, that pool's been open to the block since before you even knew this place existed. We've all used it. Cookouts, summer parties, kids' birthdays. It's a shared space." "It's not. I bought this house. I pay the bills. That pool's on private property." Karen's eyes flashed. "We don't do this mine thing around here. You might have paid some money, but you don't own this neighborhood. People don't like it when someone new comes in and tries to play queen." "I don't care who likes it," Madison said flatly. "You don't get to use my home like it's a public park." Karen's mouth tightened. "You really want to make enemies out here?" "I want you to leave me alone." Karen leaned into the gate, the bars creaking faintly under her weight. "Bad things happen when people isolate themselves. You think you're so smart, locking things down, putting up signs? You're not ready for what comes next." She turned and walked off, her steps heavy and loud, making sure Madison heard every retreating footfall. There was no resolution, no final word, just a warning left to rot in the silence. That evening, Madison found broken eggs splattered against the back fence. It wasn't dramatic, just 3 messes left to crust and rot in the sun. But it was targeted, personal. She took pictures, documented the time. She didn't call the police. Not yet. But something shifted in her. The next morning, she ordered a weatherproof camera and installed it discreetly under the eaves. Not a warning, an archive. The acts that followed were subtle, not always visible but clearly designed to wear her down. A delivery marked, "Left at door," that never arrived. 2 of her bills came late, 1 missing entirely. A neighbor she'd never spoken to suddenly started watching her through their window as she unloaded groceries. There were no words, no messages, just changes in the air, like the pressure before a storm. She adapted. She documented. She filed photos, emails, screenshots. When the pool was sabotaged, its cover half ripped back and a bucket of what looked like filthy mop water dumped inside, she didn't scream. She cleaned it for hours in silence, then logged the incident and filed a non-emergency police report. The officer who showed up was young, careful with his words. He took notes, promised to include her footage, Karen walking past the house that morning, in the file. But it was clear this wouldn't go anywhere. "Unless you catch them in the act or there's real damage, there's not much we can do," he told her. Madison didn't argue. She just added the report to her growing folder. By now, the hostility wasn't isolated. She noticed Karen walking by more often, slower each time, sometimes talking loudly into her phone about entitled little girls or people who think they're better than the rest of us. She wasn't even trying to be covert. It was theater. Madison knew better than to engage. Instead, she called an attorney. Not for a lawsuit, yet, but for clarity. The woman on the phone, Eleanor, had a voice like broken glass and confidence to match. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "Document everything," she said. "Every insult, every incident, every piece of evidence. The more neutral your response, the more powerful your position. Don't play their game. And if it escalates, then we use the evidence, but don't try to fight chaos with chaos. Use structure, use law." It was good advice, cold, rational, and deeply effective. Madison followed it exactly. The next act came in the form of a sign taped to her own front gate, crudely printed, black marker over white poster board. "You don't belong here." It wasn't signed. No fingerprints. She logged it, photographed it, carefully pulled it down and placed it in a sealed folder. When she checked the camera footage, there was a dark figure, face turned away, hood up. No usable visuals. Still, it went into the file. What followed was worse. Someone had gone through her trash. It was subtle. The lid wasn't left askew. Nothing was visibly missing. But several ripped envelopes and receipts she was sure she'd thrown away were no longer inside. She started locking the bin in her garage. She bought a shredder. She labeled every bag. Then came the leak. Her pool pump line had been slit. Not enough to burst, but enough to bleed pressure and trigger an error. The repair tech confirmed it wasn't wear and tear. Madison paid in cash, filed the receipt, saved the service report. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. But every day the weight grew heavier, pressing into her chest like a stone that wouldn't move. There was no confrontation, no single explosion, just the relentless erosion of normalcy. And she began to realize this wasn't about a pool, or even about her. It was about resistance. Someone had decided she didn't belong, and they were going to make her feel it, one violation at a time. Still, she didn't back down. She adjusted her routine. She never left the house without checking the cameras. She stopped speaking to any neighbors. When someone waved, she nodded coldly and moved on. She built a wall of documentation, of detachment. And still they came. The final blow in that string of violations came in an envelope, dropped inside her mailbox without postage. No return address. Inside, a printed message in all caps. "You're a disease to this neighborhood. People like you ruin communities." No signature, no fingerprints, just ink on paper, as impersonal as it was cruel. Madison didn't shake. She didn't panic. She put on gloves, took photos, slipped it into plastic. She updated the timeline. She called Eleanor and sent the photos. She didn't let the fear rule her, but she knew now, with a certainty that carved deep into her spine, that this was only going to get worse. Madison had learned to live in silence, not the peaceful kind. The silence of vigilance, of every creak and noise pulling her attention toward the window. She wasn't scared in the way people describe in books. There was no trembling, no sense of helplessness. But the tension had become constant, like a wire pulled taut, humming invisibly in her mind. The pool, ironically, had gone unused by anyone for weeks, covered and locked, yet it had become the symbol of the neighborhood's hostility. And she knew, she felt it, that something was brewing behind that forced civility people wore like masks when they passed her gate. The weather had shifted too. The warmth clung longer, humidity heavier than usual, like the sky refused to let go of what it was holding in. It happened late in the afternoon. Madison returned from the store and noticed immediately. The gate was unlocked. She knew the exact way the chain wrapped, the weight of it, how it settled slightly off-center when secured. Now it dangled straight down, unlatched as though someone had casually flicked it open. Her throat tightened not in fear but in preparation. She walked slowly, deliberately avoiding the instinct to rush. The sign, the one she had made, laminated and screwed into the fence, reading, "Pool closed due to health violation," with Karen's printed photo, was gone. Torn from its bolts, screws still hanging from the wood like broken teeth. Her eyes scanned the yard. The water was still. Nothing looked disturbed, but something had changed. She approached the edge of the pool, and her stomach sank. There, floating near the drain, were plastic bags. Dozens of them. Grocery bags filled with what looked like animal waste, old food, possibly even chemicals. The stench hit her a moment later, raw and chemical, rotten and sharp. Whoever did this wanted it to be a message. She backed away immediately, grabbed her phone and took photos from every angle. She didn't call 911. This wasn't a life-threatening emergency, but she called the non-emergency line again and asked for an officer. She explained the situation clearly, without emotion, but when she mentioned the pattern, the previous incidents, and the fact that her sign was missing, the dispatcher's voice shifted from polite to clinical. "An officer will be dispatched when available." The officer who arrived took his time. He walked the perimeter, took some photos of his own, and asked questions that felt more like formalities. "Any cameras?" "Yes," Madison said. "I've got footage of the gate being opened, and I'm reviewing the night feed now. But if someone wore a hood again, it may not be useful." He nodded, but she could see in his posture that this was routine, something he'd file away without priority. "You know," he added, "sometimes people act out when they feel like they're being antagonized. That sign, with someone's face on it—" "She trespassed," Madison interrupted. "She swam in my pool without permission. The sign was a deterrent. What she's doing is targeted harassment." The officer didn't disagree, but he didn't argue either. He handed her a case number and left. Madison didn't expect justice from them, but it hurt, more than she wanted to admit, that even with the footage, the reports, and the evidence, it still felt like she was being asked to defend herself for not being passive. Cleaning the pool took 3 full days and over $1,000. The water had to be drained, the filter system flushed, and a specialist had to inspect the chemical balance before it was deemed safe again. She kept every invoice, every email, every time-stamped photograph. But even as the pool cleared, her head did not. The feeling of being watched returned stronger than ever. One night she found her security camera turned slightly, as though someone had reached up with a stick and pushed it away from the yard. The video showed only static for several hours. She installed a second hidden camera the next day. Then came the petition. It wasn't official, just a stack of papers taped to her front gate. A childish header read, "Stop the harassment. Let the neighborhood breathe." Underneath were names. Real names. Neighbors she'd barely spoken to. A few she recognized only in passing. Some had signed it with smiley faces. Others had added comments like, "We're tired of drama," and "Enough with the aggression." It was surreal. She'd barely interacted with any of these people, yet they'd labeled her the threat. That night someone rang her doorbell and ran. Then again, and again. Every hour until sunrise. When she disabled the bell's chime, they threw something at her window, just enough to make noise, not enough to break glass. The mental fatigue was becoming physical. Her muscles ached. Her sleep fragmented into pieces. She started keeping lights on through the night, both inside and outside. The cameras became her only comfort. Unblinking eyes when she could no longer stay awake. Eleanor, her lawyer, became a lifeline. They spoke twice a week now. Eleanor advised her to begin preparing a civil case, not against Karen, not yet, but in the form of a general harassment claim. "This will take time," she said, "but your documentation is solid. We can argue pattern and escalation. We can bring in local code violations, even restraining orders if necessary." Madison agreed. She didn't want revenge. She wanted it to stop. But Karen wasn't slowing down. A week later, a letter arrived in a manila envelope without postage, again. Inside was a photocopy of what looked like a legal notice. Madison's breath caught in her throat as she read, "A mock notice of public nuisance." It looked official. Language pulled from local ordinances, stamped with a fake seal, referencing noise complaints, environmental hazards, and violations of community peace. The text accused her of everything from unlawful signage to endangering children with chemical exposure. It wasn't from any agency, but it was convincing enough that someone unfamiliar with city codes might have believed it. Madison immediately scanned it, then cross-referenced it with Eleanor. "All fabricated," Eleanor said, "but this could constitute mail fraud or impersonation of a public official. We can leverage this." Madison's response was quiet but methodical. She submitted the document to the police again. She added it to her case file. She updated her timeline. Then, in a decision that felt both petty and necessary, she printed her own notice. Private property under video surveillance. Legal action in process. She mounted it where the old sign used to be. Days passed. No one approached the pool again. But the atmosphere became more hostile. Cold stares followed her to the grocery store. A man she'd never met muttered, "Troublemaker," as he passed her aisle. At the gas station, someone left a flyer under her windshield that read, "Some people just don't belong." Still, she didn't stop. She documented it all. One morning, her car had a fresh scratch running from front to rear, shallow but deliberate. The next day, a dead rat was left in her mailbox. She didn't scream. She wore gloves, bagged the carcass, and called animal control. When they arrived, she asked for documentation. They gave her a short incident report, which she filed. Karen remained strangely silent through this period. No confrontations, no appearances, no obvious involvement. But Madison had no illusions. The weight of Karen's influence, her manipulation of the social current around them, was everywhere. It was like trying to swim upstream in tar. The final straw of the escalation came not through violence, but deceit. A man arrived at her door wearing a polo shirt with a local pest control logo. He said someone from her address had requested a full backyard fumigation. Madison hadn't. The man seemed confused. He showed her a printed order form complete with her name and address. It had been submitted online. There was no phone number attached. He hadn't confirmed before arriving. Madison thanked him, declined the service, and took a photo of the document. It was terrifying, not because it worked, but because someone had used her name to manipulate a system, to get a stranger onto her property. Someone was testing boundaries, figuring out what they could get away with. And worse, they were starting to act through third parties, pushing the risk away from themselves. Madison realized she was up against something more insidious than harassment. This was a campaign, a coordinated effort to destabilize her psychologically, socially, and maybe even legally. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But that night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the folder that now held hundreds of pages of evidence, and she knew that what came next had to be stronger, smarter, and more calculated than anything before. She wasn't just protecting a pool anymore. She was protecting her autonomy, her right to exist without being broken down, piece by people who couldn't stand the idea of boundaries. Madison had never seen herself as someone who would hire private security, but that's exactly what she did. Not the dramatic kind. No uniforms or guards patrolling with flashlights, just one discreet, off-duty officer named Jenna, whom Eleanor recommended. Jenna wasn't there to intimidate anyone. Her job was to observe, document, and most importantly, make Madison feel like she wasn't alone in this anymore. For the first time in weeks, Madison allowed herself to sleep without waking at every sound. Jenna stayed in a car parked across the street, took notes, and filed observations. Within days, Jenna began to identify patterns: cars that slowed down more than once a night, people who lingered too long near the fence, neighbors who parked farther from their own homes than necessary, and strolled past Madison's gate under the guise of a walk. It wasn't criminal, not yet, but it was undeniably orchestrated, and Madison realized the psychological nature of the assault had become as damaging as the physical incidents. At Eleanor's urging, she submitted everything, every new report, Jenna's notes, the pest control fraud, the photos of the pool contamination, into one formal civil claim, centered around malicious harassment and endangerment. But Eleanor warned her. Even with documentation, these kinds of cases rarely moved quickly, and worse, if the other side realized legal pressure was mounting, they might escalate before retreating. Madison understood. She wasn't hoping for a swift resolution anymore. She was preparing for the next hit, and it came in the form of leverage. Someone, Karen, likely, sent a letter to Madison's employer, an anonymous complaint, vague but insidious, accusing her of public disorder, neighbor endangering behavior, and creating a hostile environment. They referenced police involvement, dangerous chemical usage, and hinted that Madison might be mentally unstable, all without providing verifiable details. The letter wasn't signed, but it was professionally typed, sent through priority mail, and addressed to HR. Madison's job wasn't local. She worked remotely for a tech firm out of state, but HR was required to conduct a standard check. Her manager called her with soft words, emphasizing that they believed her, but they needed to follow protocol. The shame Madison felt wasn't rational. She'd done nothing wrong, but the reach of the harassment had broken containment. It was no longer just her property or her neighborhood. It was her reputation, her livelihood. And again, it had been done without a single face revealing itself. Karen remained the eye of the storm, eerily calm, never approaching, never contacting, but unmistakably present behind every maneuver. Madison's restraint began to burn. She wanted to confront Karen, scream at her in the middle of the street, drag every piece of proof into the sun. But Jenna reminded her, that's what they want. A meltdown. A reaction that could be filmed, twisted, turned against her. So Madison did something better. She filed a restraining order, not against Karen specifically, not yet, but as a general petition to protect her home and safety due to repeated, targeted harassment. It wouldn't guarantee anything, but it laid the foundation for further legal steps. She also met with a local environmental health officer and walked them through the pool contamination incident in detail. While they couldn't press criminal charges without a suspect, they documented the damage and added it to a formal report. Every move Madison made now was strategic. She was building a wall, not of bricks but of records, affidavits, agency involvement. Karen could still laugh at signs and gates, but she couldn't laugh away a court docket. Then came the misstep, not by Madison, but by whoever had been doing Karen's dirty work. Late one night, a man was caught on the hidden rear camera trying to force open her tool shed. He didn't get in, and he fled when the motion-activated lights hit, but his face was clear. Madison didn't know him, but Jenna recognized him immediately. He was a local freelance laborer who did odd jobs in the area, sometimes for cash, sometimes for favors. His name was Rick, and Jenna confirmed he'd done seasonal work for Karen's property more than once. Armed with the footage, Madison and Eleanor submitted it to the police again, this time with a demand to investigate. The image quality was high enough that the man couldn't deny his presence. That changed everything. Rick was called in for questioning. He didn't confess, not fully, but under pressure, admitted he was asked to check on some tools by a neighbor and thought it was unlocked. No charges were filed yet, but it forced police to acknowledge a link between the harassment and a real individual. It was the crack Madison needed. Suddenly, silence. Days passed. No new letters, no vandalism, no strange cars. It felt less like peace and more like a pause. Madison didn't let her guard down. She installed a second layer of locks on every door. She added a privacy screen to the back fence. And quietly, without telling anyone but Eleanor and Jenna, she began preparing to counterattack. Not through revenge, not through confrontation, but through a coordinated legal and personal maneuver that would expose every lie, every petty manipulation, and every coward hiding behind anonymity. She wasn't just defending her life anymore, she was reclaiming the right to not be broken. It was nearly 2 weeks after Rick's failed break-in attempt that Madison noticed the shift, not in behavior, but in silence. The hostile glances from neighbors subsided, replaced by something colder, more calculated. Not indifference, but coordinated distance. She'd expected retaliation for reporting Rick, perhaps another wave of petty vandalism or fabricated complaints, but instead the environment changed subtly, like a curtain falling after a scene. And when the next move came, it was legal, not physical. A formal complaint was filed against Madison at the county level. The letter arrived by certified mail, folded and bound in official tone, bearing the letterhead of the Department of Building and Safety. It alleged unpermitted modifications to exterior structures, citing a violation of zoning regulations, obstruction of sight lines, and unauthorized use of surveillance equipment visible from the street. It accused her of creating environmental hazards with excessive chlorine exposure and failing to secure her yard against community health threats. The complaint wasn't a citation, it was an investigative notice, and it meant an inspection was scheduled. The language was clean, bureaucratic, and deeply threatening. Madison's hands trembled as she held the paper, not from fear, but from the realization that Karen had moved the fight to a higher level. Someone had spent time drafting that report. It wasn't emotional. It was weaponized professionalism. Eleanor reviewed the document and confirmed it was legitimate in form but likely built on false information. Worse, The inclusion of camera visibility and sightline obstruction indicated someone had been monitoring her layout closely. The pool signs, the privacy screens, even the shed that Rick had tried to break into, it was all being used against her. The inspection was scheduled for Thursday morning. Madison didn't sleep the night before. She cleaned obsessively, reorganized tools, printed copies of every permit she had, labeled each camera as residential surveillance with adhesive tags. She prepared binders of photos showing the original state of the yard, receipts for fence work, documentation that the screen wall had existed since before her purchase. When the inspector arrived, he was neutral but firm, clipboard in hand, walking the property with practiced detachment. He didn't accuse her of anything but noted every structure. He took photos, asked about the camera angles. He asked if any neighbors had access to the backyard. Madison said no. He asked how long the signs had been posted. She answered honestly. He left without giving an opinion. That afternoon, she received an automated notice that the report would be filed within 7 business days. Eleanor advised her to prepare a statement disputing every point in writing, which they drafted together. The waiting stretched out like a wire pulled too far, and Madison knew the purpose of the complaint hadn't been enforcement. It had been exhaustion. Bureaucracy as a tool for psychological siege. The same day the inspector left, Madison's internet went out. Not briefly, a full-service disruption that her provider initially claimed was a line break. When the technician arrived, he showed her the cable at the street. It had been physically severed, cleanly and deliberately, with no signs of weather damage. The cut was made below the junction point, requiring specific knowledge of its placement. The technician replaced the segment, muttering that this wasn't the first time he'd seen something like this in the area. Madison documented it, sent a photo of the cut to Eleanor. Then she called Jenna and asked her to increase nighttime surveillance. Jenna rotated shifts with a second colleague now, one parked across the street, the other monitoring remote access feeds from Madison's network. Nothing overt happened that night. No approach, no vandalism. But just before dawn, motion sensors in the front yard were triggered. No entry, no damage. Just a 30-second spike in the feed. Movement detected near the bushes, never caught directly on camera. It was enough. The next morning, Madison requested a protective order hearing. She had names now, Rick's on record, the building inspector's report in progress, the severed line, the surveillance data. Her file wasn't a story anymore. It was a case. But even as she moved through the legal system, the neighborhood turned. Her trash wasn't picked up. She found a note taped to the bin, handwritten, unsigned, claiming she'd violated waste separation rules. She called the sanitation department, who denied issuing any warnings. At the grocery store, a cashier she'd spoken to once now avoided eye contact. People she didn't know stood outside her house in the evening, chatting loudly, their conversations just loud enough to carry phrases like trouble, weird, thinks she's better. It was psychological shrapnel. Every interaction felt scripted, controlled. She was the villain in someone else's narrative. And then it got physical again. Madison came home one evening and saw the side gate hanging off one hinge. The padlock was still attached, but the bolt had been partially pried loose. Inside, everything seemed untouched, but a single item was missing, the laminated copy of the original pool sign, the one with Karen's photo. It hadn't been posted in weeks, but Madison had kept it filed away in the shed, sealed in a bin. Nothing else was disturbed, just that one piece taken with surgical precision. She felt the implication immediately. This wasn't about vandalism. It was about removal, erasure, proof stolen, control reasserted. Jenna reviewed the footage. The feed had gone blank for 12 minutes, the exact window of the breach. Someone had jammed the signal, or worse, looped it. It wasn't amateur. Madison filed a police report again. The officer was polite, but made no promises. No clear footage, no fingerprints, no forced entry. hard to pursue. She knew the drill. Eleanor updated the restraining order request. Madison added a new lock system with internal alerts, sent text notifications directly to her phone, Jenna's, and Eleanor's office. Then came the envelope. Left under the windshield wiper of her car, which was parked inside her locked garage. The note was typed, folded neatly. There are other ways to make you leave. You don't have to stay for what's coming. No signature. No threat specific enough to prosecute. Just tone. Just implication. Jenna suggested stepping up security even further. Motion floodlights, reinforced doors, monitored entry logs. Madison agreed. She was no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. She was securing the perimeter of a life that had become a war zone. Days passed. The inspector's report arrived. It was inconclusive. No violations confirmed, but several areas of concern marked for monitoring. A technical win, but not a victory. The implication was clear. We're watching. Madison didn't flinch. She filed her written rebuttal. She met with Eleanor and approved a plan to move the harassment case toward court. The goal wasn't revenge. It was acknowledgement. Official recognition that what had been done to her wasn't neighborly friction. It was targeted abuse, calculated and sustained. The final moment of the second escalation came in the form of a party. Karen hosted it. Balloons, catering trays, music loud enough to shake the glass. Her yard overflowed with people, laughter, celebration. But the decorations told the truth. At the center of the lawn, visible from Madison's window, was a makeshift banner. Community belongs to everyone. Below it, a printed image of a chain-wrapped pool gate, distorted, zoomed in, with a red slash through it. It was a message, and everyone there was in on the joke. Madison closed her blinds. She didn't cry. She walked to her office, opened her evidence folder, and added a new label. Retaliatory public display. 3 witnesses. And then she opened her calendar and marked the court date in red. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. No wood-paneled walls or rising music, just fluorescent lights, beige carpeting, and a single fan clicking somewhere behind the judge's bench. Madison sat quietly beside Eleanor, dressed in neutral tones, her expression composed not out of calm, but out of calculation. She had learned how to survive in hostile territory, and this, though surrounded by law and order, was still a battlefield. Karen sat at the opposing table, flanked by a man in a cheap gray suit who looked vaguely irritated at having to be there. She wore a cardigan, her hair in a loose bun, and a face crafted for sympathy. It was the face she likely wore in church, the face she used when petitioning for community events. But Madison had seen what hid behind it, and now the court would see it too. Eleanor had built the case carefully. This wasn't a criminal trial, and no jury would deliberate. It was a hearing to formalize the civil harassment complaint and request a permanent protective order. The goal wasn't to send Karen to jail. It was to restrict her access, validate the abuse, and document it in the system permanently. That mattered more than revenge. It was recognition. The first hour was dry. Procedural questions, confirmations of names, a brief overview of the complaint. The judge was older, deliberate in speech, with sharp eyes that missed little. When Eleanor began, she didn't start with the pool. She started with the pattern, the documented timeline of events spanning months. The photos, the police reports, the inspection orders, the anonymous letters, the pest control fraud, the vandalized gate, the stolen surveillance material. Each piece presented not with emotion, but with precision. Eleanor spoke in terms of escalation, of psychological destabilization, of sustained targeting. When she played the video of Rick attempting to break into the shed, the judge leaned forward. When she submitted the statement from the pest technician and the digital forensics report confirming network interference with the cameras, he scribbled notes. Madison remained silent throughout. her posture rigid, her eyes fixed straight ahead. This wasn't performance. It was endurance. Then it was Karen's turn. Her attorney opened with a sigh disguised as a formal introduction. His defense was structured around community misunderstanding, suggesting Madison had isolated herself and misinterpreted neighborly behavior. He used words like miscommunication, overreaction, cultural dissonance. He implied that Madison had created a hostile environment by assuming the worst of people who just wanted to preserve long-standing neighborhood traditions. When he spoke about the signs and the pool lock, he framed them as excessive reactions that naturally upset others. Then Karen spoke. Her tone was soft, hesitant, as if unsure whether she was the victim or the accused. She said she'd used the pool without thinking, that she thought it was still under open access like it had been for years. She said she tried to talk to Madison but was shut down and humiliated. She called the photo sign an act of public shaming. She denied any knowledge of Rick's actions, of the sabotage, the letters, the severed cable. "I'm not a criminal," she said, voice quivering. "I'm a grandmother. I just wanted to keep the neighborhood friendly." Eleanor didn't interrupt. She waited. Then she rose, walked to the center of the room, and held up the printed banner photo from Karen's party, the one with the red slash across the image of Madison's locked gate. This was displayed in the defendant's yard during a public event, following months of legal escalation, harassment claims, and active litigation. This isn't misunderstanding. This is retaliation. Karen's lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. Then Eleanor submitted the final piece, an affidavit from Rick, obtained after he was served with a separate civil action in which he admitted that Karen had offered him cash to check the shed, and that she'd complained about the camera and the sign. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough. Enough to link her to physical trespass. Enough to prove that the campaign wasn't an accident of social friction. It was personal. The judge recessed for 30 minutes. Madison stepped outside, not to breathe but to move. Her legs ached from stillness. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and dust. She didn't check her phone. She didn't look at Karen, who stood talking in hushed tones with her attorney, occasionally glancing over with eyes full of crafted innocence. When the judge returned, the courtroom was silent. He read from the bench. His voice was dry but clear. The court found sufficient evidence to support the claim of sustained, targeted harassment. A permanent civil protective order was issued. Karen was legally prohibited from contacting Madison, entering her property, speaking to her directly or through intermediaries, and within 72 hours would be required to remove any public signage, digital or physical, that referenced the plaintiff. The order would remain in place for 3 years, with possible extension. Additionally, the court referred portions of the case to the district attorney's office for review of possible municipal violations and property sabotage. Karen's face didn't fall. It froze, like something had finally caught up to her and she hadn't expected it would. Madison didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She stood, nodded to Eleanor, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside, Jenna was waiting near the curb. She didn't ask how it went. She could see it on Madison's face, the exhaustion, the clarity, the finality. Madison sat in the car, closed the door, and let out a long breath. Not relief, not triumph. Something deeper. The sensation of having stood her ground and survived. She'd never get back the months lost to fear, the nights haunted by imagined footsteps, the dignity chipped away piece by piece. But she'd carved a boundary with law and consequence, and now it was real. Not because Karen recognized it, but because the system did. It wasn't justice, but it was victory. The weeks following the court decision passed not with celebration, but with a gradual loosening of tension, like pressure finally bleeding from a sealed valve. There were no more anonymous letters, No more shadows by the gate. No more notes tucked under windshield wipers. Karen disappeared from the street almost entirely. Her car still parked in the driveway, the porch still decorated with wind chimes and seasonal wreaths, but her presence withdrawn like a puppet cut from its strings. Madison didn't wonder what that silence meant. She knew. The humiliation of losing in a courtroom wasn't just legal for someone like Karen, it was social. Her grip on the neighborhood, once enforced with polite gossip and passive-aggressive clout, had been severed by the one thing she couldn't control: documented truth. The banner from the party vanished overnight. The faces that once scowled at Madison now offered nods or avoided her gaze entirely. A few neighbors even waved, hesitant gestures like olive branches passed between strangers too tired to keep fighting. Madison didn't respond to all of them. She wasn't bitter, but she wasn't interested in reconciliation for the sake of optics. She hadn't fought to be accepted. She'd fought to be left alone. That, finally, was what she had. The pool remained locked, though not out of fear anymore. It had become a symbol now, not of luxury or leisure, but of control reclaimed. Madison would unlock it when she felt like swimming. She'd leave the gate closed when she wanted peace. No signs, no warnings, just ownership. And that was enough. The cameras stayed up, not as paranoia but as precaution. Part of a quiet perimeter she kept not only physically but mentally. She'd learned something about boundaries. Not just how to enforce them, but how to recognize when they were being tested in ways that didn't look like trespassing but felt just as invasive. She still kept the case folder, still updated it when something minor happened, like a stranger asking too many questions at the gate, or a neighbor making a cryptic remark about things being quieter now. Not because she expected the war to resume, but because the quiet itself had taught her not to be naive. Peace wasn't granted, it was guarded. Eleanor remained in contact, now less like a lawyer and more like a distant ally. They didn't talk often, but when they did, the conversations were crisp, efficient, edged with mutual respect. Jenna finished her final shift 3 weeks after the ruling, leaving Madison with a handshake and a firm warning. Keep everything. People like Karen don't forget when they lose. Madison promised she would. Summer passed slowly into fall. The trees changed. The air cooled. Madison spent more time in her garden, pulling weeds by hand, restoring order with deliberate care. It was the kind of labor that didn't require screens or strategy, just patience and attention. The house began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home again, though she still flinched when unfamiliar footsteps passed the fence. That, she assumed, might never leave her completely. One afternoon, while trimming the ivy near the gate, Madison found a laminated copy of her original pool-closed sign inside a plastic bag tucked into the shrubbery. Not torn, not defaced, just sitting there like something returned after being taken. Whether it was guilt, mockery, or a final gesture of truce, she didn't care. She threw it in the trash and said nothing. Months later, a new family moved into the house across from Karen's. Young couple, 2 kids, dog that barked too much. Madison watched them unpack boxes, set up patio furniture, laugh too loudly. For a moment, she felt something close to envy, that pre-hurt state of being unaware of how things could go wrong. But then she turned back toward the pool, toward her garden, toward the life she had reassembled not from comfort, but from resistance. In time, she wrote an article. Nothing sensational, just a long, steady piece on a legal blog about the process of documenting harassment, about the difference between conflict and campaign, about how power often wears a friendly face. She didn't use names, she didn't need to. The message was clear. That post was shared quietly among online communities, among advocacy groups, among women who recognize themselves between the lines. Some emailed her. Some asked for copies of her evidence tracker template. Some just said thank you. She never spoke to Karen again, and that was the best part of all.